Hello everyone, welcome to PSY 104F. Since there's a little bit of room at the front, if nobody's super against it, I'm going to take my mask off just while I talk. In my last class, I had students right up against the podium, so I just did an hour projecting with it on. So I'm just going to try and stay. Oop. There we go. Oh dear. I touched something. There it goes. Okay, I won't touch it again. All right, so I always like to start off by talking about who I am and why I'm standing up here talking at you guys, because I'm going to be doing that for the next 4 or so months. And when I was an undergrad, I didn't quite understand why every instructor did this, but I've come to realize that as I go through this course, I'm trying to teach you how to be critical of information. Where is information coming from? Who's giving it to you? What is that information? So by me telling you who I am and where I've got my education and what my background is, that's me giving you my credentials. That's you showing who's giving you that information and why they are an authority who can talk on that topic. So, unlike how when I was younger, I thought, well, why does everybody get in front of the classroom and list their accomplishments? It's not a bragging thing, it's a now you know thing. So I am Dr. Kimberly Campbell. You can call me Dr. Campbell, you can call me Kimberly, both are acceptable. I got my Bachelor of Science at Dalhousie University. I didn't actually start in psychology. I interestingly started in physics and then realized I was really bad with numbers, so I switched to bio. So my undergrad degree was in mainly genetics and evolution, and I worked in a lab for a couple of years doing PCR and cloning, but I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. I then completely switched gears and decided to go into psychology. So I got my master's and my Doctor of Philosophy at the U of A in fairly recent years. So I switched from my single-celled organisms and looking at their genomes to studying communication in black-capped chickadees, which is quite the pivot, I must say. I've also started including sort of me other than academia, so who I am as a person, so I'm not just some faceless academic. I am an avid bird lover. I have 2 birds at home, I study birds, I try and keep the bird examples to a minimum. We'll see how successfully. I love chocolate. I take photographs as much as possible. It's a creative outlet that is far less time-consuming than most artistic pursuits. I have played Pokemon since I was probably 12, and I like to collect hobbies. Yeah. Only in the very early years. I think I had red, and I think I finished that, and then after that it was way too many to keep track of. But I always try and then get distracted halfway. I'll hop forward a slide and then hop back. I include pictures of my research assistants, not only because having cute animals in pictures is awesome, but because if ever I record something at home, they make an appearance. If you've ever had birds or known someone who has birds, they don't do quiet, they don't do in a minute, it's right now. So I have filters and stuff to remove them from the background. Well, it's not super successful. I have had to re-record many lectures while I was teaching online because one of them really likes to sit on my mic. And if you know anything about sun conures, they can hit like 90 decibels. So yeah, deafen everyone. So I just give a little bit of a, there might be noise in the background if I record an announcement or something at home. But yeah, so a little bit more on my research background. So not just degree credentials, but also what have I hands-on done. As my undergraduate research, I did sequencing DNA to identify single-celled organisms in soil samples, which is just as thrilling as it sounds. We went to the beach, we dug up dirt, we brought it back to the lab, and we extracted DNA from all of the single-celled organisms in that dirt. And then we would sequence it. We'd run it through a system and send it off to get DNA sequenced. Because at that time, the university didn't have their own sequencers. So we sent it to Quebec, and they sent it back and said, these are the species you had. It was kind of cool because we found 2 that didn't quite fit into any category. So we found new species that we figure were related to 2 known species, but not quite, which I found exciting. And then, as I said, I pivoted and I studied learning and communication in black-capped chickadees now. So when we get into the chapter on learning, I like to do a little bit of a mini detour, and we talk about operant conditioning in chickadees. So how they learn to perceive differences between sounds, and they can learn to categorize or group different sounds as being similar to one another, which is pretty cool. But we'll do more of that in chapter 6 or 7. I can't remember which one learning is. All right, and then the last sort of intro to me is a little bit about my teaching style. So you might have noticed I have very boring slides, and that's intentional. Early on in my learning career, I had a couple of students who had vision difficulties. They had a lot of trouble with with low contrast images, which textbook figures are really bad for. So I started converting all of my slides and as many images as I could to high contrast, just to make it easier. So yeah, they're a little bit boring, but that's intentional just so that they're more accessible. And in the same way that having a conversation with students early on in my career led to a change in my approach, I'm always looking for feedback or suggestions. If you think it would be neat to include something in the class, don't ever hesitate to let me know. I don't mind, and I'm always looking to improve. And then for you guys, with my teaching philosophy, I always encourage you to make use of the extra resources that are available. So I like to share videos and extra links. I love what I teach about, so I get really excited about topics, and I'll include things that are just for your information, but they're really cool. And sometimes learning about things that are interesting helps you understand the basics. I let you know very clearly what is and isn't sort of core material. If there's just a link on a slide, that's for your information. And I have slides that I label with FYI, just because I thought they were neat and wanted to talk about them, but don't want you to have to memorize them. I also am open to people asking questions, asking for help. If you're comfortable asking questions in class, go for it. If you want to wait till after class, that's fine too. I've been trying to let my classes go just a little bit early so that you have some time with the shuffle in the hallways, you can get to your next classes. And then if you have questions, we have a little bit of buffer time too. So that's a kind of nice approach. And you can send me an email if you want to ask questions by email, that's fine. Or email me and we set up a Zoom call. Whatever works for you. I love talking about science, so it's pretty easy to get me going. All right, so part 2 is actually our first of my detours into things that are not testable. This is just for your information. I like including stuff that I think is useful, but not necessarily testable. And this is because when I was in academia, I went to a fairly large undergraduate school, and I was terrified to interact with any of my instructors. I didn't know how to talk to them, nothing. So the first time I talked to an instructor, at that time it was actually a professor, was to start in a lab. And I had no idea what I was doing. So whenever I have a first year class, I like to give you the information that I wish I had had. So we have this issue where if you're contacting somebody and you've never talked to them before, you can kind of get stuck on how do I address them? Do I call them instructor? Do I call them doctor, professor? What do I say? How does this work? And most of this is through emails. It also works for face-to-face as well. For the rules on how you use these, a doctor is going to be somebody who has a PhD or an MD. I'm experienced on the PhD side of things, so that's what I usually encounter. So if somebody has a PhD, you can call them doctor, their last name, and you're pretty safe. A professor is going to be somebody, almost always somebody who is also a doctor, who was hired as a professor. So professor, at least in North America, is a job title. So you can call them professor last name or doctor last name, both would be acceptable. And then we have another category that is instructor. So it's someone who isn't a professor, but is teaching a course. And an instructor doesn't necessarily have to have a PhD. And I did a visual for this because just the words did not work for my brain either. So I have a Venn diagram. So for me, I have my PhD, so doctor works for me. I am hired as an instructor. My official title is assistant lecturer, I think. They keep changing them on me. But I am not hired as a professor, so professor doesn't work in my case. But doctor works. If you had somebody else and you wanted to sort of look up what you should use for them, I used the example of my graduate studies supervisor, so Chris Sturdy. So we can see from his listing on the university that he works at that he has a PhD. So we can call him Dr. Sturdy and we can feel pretty safe. From his job title, he's also a professor of science. So we could call him Professor Sturdy, and that would also be pretty safe. So that's how I would decide how to email him. If he only had an M after his name, then you wouldn't go with doctor because he doesn't have the PhD. His is an MA. It's kind of hidden there, but it's just for a master's. Yeah, so you can look these up for anybody you want to interact with. And then I give the sort of little caveat of if you contact somebody and you do the official introduction, you say, hey, Dr. Campbell, here's my email, sincerely your name. If I respond and in my sign-off, I just use my first name, that's me saying that I'm okay with you just using my first name. So if you send an email to somebody, check what they respond and sign as, because that's usually a good indicator of what they're comfortable being called. So sometimes they'll correct you. So if you say Miss Campbell, I would then correct with, oh no, Dr. Campbell or Kimberly, because those are the correct terms. And that's just sort of a little bit of academic bureaucracy, I guess, that nobody actually tells you, but I find is really helpful to know because then you don't feel like you're starting off on the wrong foot. Okay, so as I said, that's our first major detour. Part 3, we're going to actually get into this course in particular. So if you've already taken a class at Concordia, this might be a lot of sort of information you already know, but because it's a first year class, I am going to go into a little bit more detail. So if you've done this before, you can feel free to zone out for a couple of minutes. But the most important tool that you're going to have for this course is Moodle. So Moodle is the online site, and you'll have a course site specifically for this course where you have access to all of the information that you need for this class. So you can find general information, things like the syllabus for this course. Any announcements will go through Moodle, as well as I like to list frequently asked questions. If I get the same question multiple times from different students, that usually means that I haven't explained something clearly or maybe something's a little bit confusing. So then I'll post an actual explanation so that everybody has that extra info, and then I'll try and be clearer next time. But there's always going to be useful information there. The announcements that go through Moodle should also get sent to your student email account, so you can make sure that you check your emails and you'll get those announcements as well. You don't necessarily have to check the announcements specifically every day. Moodle's also going to be a resource for a lot of course assessments. I'll give you the instructions on what to expect for things like midterms. We'll also talk about that stuff in class, but it's nice to have it written down so that you can see it. I'm also going to put up our lecture recordings and slides. So I have my setup here from online recording. I brought everything in so that I can record my screen. And that means that if you don't ever want to be on campus, you can't be on campus, you've missed a class, whatever, you have access to the entire lecture as is at home. So you don't have to miss anything, you don't have to get somebody else's notes, you can just listen to it yourself. So I'll have those available. It'll take a little while to upload after class because I have to get home and process it and post it. So it'll take a little bit of time, but probably within 24 hours you'll have access to that. And that's even if you make it to class. Maybe you want to listen to the lecture again. Maybe you didn't get the notes completely right or something. Great way to do it. And then the slides. I'm going to include the slides, so you might have figured that out already and have these slides from the website. These were just our day 1 introduction slides. I've also put up our chapter 1 slides as well, because we're going to get started just a little bit on those. But what I am going to do is actually hop over to Moodle and show you the setup here. And I always give the sort of disclaimer that this is the instructor version of the site. Yours might look just a little bit different, but I haven't figured out a way to have mine look like a student version, so the layout will be similar. I just might have more buttons than you. So at the top here, I have sort of our general information, who I am and how to contact me. So for my email address here, if you click on that, it'll actually open up an email application. And whenever you send me an email, try and include the course code in that email subject line. And that's just because I teach a couple of different classes. So if I'm going to gift you the right information, I need to know which class and which section you're in. Otherwise, I might have to ask you to clarify before I can answer. So that just saves some trouble and gives me a very quick note of, oh, this person from this class has a question. I'll deal with that right now. As promised, this is where you can find the course syllabus. I already have a copy of a similar one. I'm going to just use that one. But you can click on that to download it. This is where you can see our announcements. And then under that, I have everything set up so that you can toggle them. I've found if you don't collapse the topics, the page gets really, really long and you have to scroll forever. So this way, if you want to look at a topic, you can just expand it. And I've also included these neat little checkboxes. So one of my students in a class last semester taught me how to do these, and it's actually really helpful to keep track of what you have and haven't done in the class. So as you've studied for a particular chapter, you can check off the slides for that chapter. Or if you've done an assignment, you can check off that assignment as just a visual cue that you've done it. So I thought that was really neat. Everything has them because it's sort of an all or nothing, but that's what those are. So at the very top, I include a what to expect in this course. That's the basic frequently asked questions that I figured would be useful just getting started. So stuff like, should I read the textbook? Do I have to attend class? How do the chapter quizzes work? That sort of thing. And I have either covered or will be covering all this information. It's just sort of a Cole's Notes version before the first day of class. I'll close that. We have our textbook info here. So the Vital Source link is where you can access the ebook if you purchase it. There's also supplementary resources. So that's just extra stuff that the publisher provides for students. I believe you can just go to that link and look at, they have like questions and study guides and stuff like that. They don't tell me too much about it, but you guys will have access for it. I will be including chapter quizzes once I start making them. So because we're going to start chapter 1 today, you should see the chapter 1 quiz either today, sort of tonight, or early tomorrow at the very latest. And I will show sort of this week, I'll skip over the written assignment for right now because it's actually empty, or it's effectively empty. These are our slides. So I post everything as a PDF and as a PowerPoint file. If you need something different than that, just let me know. But I've found that these are pretty much universal. And so I try and post the slides in advance of when we start talking about something in class. So chapter 1 is what we're going to be covering all this week. So all of chapter 1 is there. And then I'll post chapter 2 in time for next week. All right, so for the syllabus, all right, ignore the fact that it says E because I'm doing E and F, and they're the same exact setup, they're just at different times. So if you haven't read through a syllabus before, if this is your first semester, I recommend reading through the whole syllabus. It's going to be a little bit dry, but it has a lot of useful information. If you have read a syllabus before, then you know most of this stuff already. A syllabus is going to be one of the best places that you can find useful information. Things like the textbook, links to stuff, like for the courses. We talk about sort of learning outcomes. This chart here is one of the most useful things you can have for this course, and that's because it's all of our lecture topics as well as all the important dates for the course. So you'll notice here that next week on September 6th, it's Labor Day, so there's no classes. So don't come here because I won't be here. I also include things like when our midterms are. So midterm 1 is on September 27th, right here in this room during class time. And it's covering chapters 1 to 3. Then Thanksgiving is no classes, then midterm 2 is November 1st, and so on. So this is a really good guide as to what we'll be talking about in class. Sometimes I move a little bit faster or slower, just depending on, I guess, how distracted I get in class. But I do a pretty good job sticking to the schedule. And if ever something happens and maybe we don't finish a topic before a test, I'll make sure to pull any and all questions related to the material we haven't covered. So if we don't quite finish chapter 3 before midterm 1, I would tell you the topics that we didn't quite get to that won't be tested on that midterm. I just think that's the fairest way to handle stuff. And then there's no pressure. For our final exam, I believe they've posted a tentative date. So if you go to your class schedule and it lists this class and the room and the times, there should also be a column that gives us the exam date. I just found it, so I don't actually remember what it is, but it's going to be early December. So I think it's like the 6th or the 8th. But take a look at that. And that's going to be written in this room as well during the window that they set for us. And as I said at the very beginning, where I'm recording everything, you don't have to be here for classes. The only time you physically need to be in the classroom is for the 2 midterms and the final. Those are the ones that are done in this room. Everything else is flexible. And that's by design, just so that everybody has those options. All right, so talking about our evaluation. So how are you getting grades in this course? As I mentioned, 2 midterms and a final. So the 2 midterms are non-cumulative. So if I scroll back up, you see that midterm 1 covers chapters 1 to 3. Then midterm 2 covers 4 to 6. There's no overlap in the content there. The only place that we start seeing cumulative questions is for the final exam. So the final exam will be more heavily weighted to new material. So for chapters 7 and 8, that's going to make up 60 or 70% of the final exam's content, but I will include some questions from earlier on. And I really love questions that cross over between old and new, so those are good because they make you think about stuff. In terms of format, scroll down to our midterms. So they're being written in class during class time. They're going to consist mostly of multiple choice questions with a couple of short answer questions. I like asking application questions. I don't like asking memorization questions. So usually you think of a multiple choice question and maybe someone would say, who is the father of clinical psychology? And they'd give you a list of names. That kind of information isn't super helpful for me in evaluating what you know. You can memorize stuff, and in the real world, you can look stuff up. And that's why I've set up my midterms and my final to be open book. So you can have your notes with you, you can make a cheat sheet, you can whatever you want. So anything on paper you can have in class for those exams, because I'm going to be focusing not on your ability to memorize things like names and dates, but I'm going to be testing your ability to apply the concepts that we've learned. So instead of asking you who invented psychoanalysis, maybe I'd say, okay, in this situation, we're going to use psychoanalysis. What procedure would be consistent with that approach? So you could look up what psychoanalysis is, but you need to know sort of how it works and what fits with that to answer the question. So that's something to keep in mind as we go through some of the content. I do drop hints about types of questions I would ask whenever it occurs to me, just because that helps you guys know what I'm looking for. All right, so that's the midterms. I'm also going to have chapter quizzes. And chapter quizzes are going to fill a different role. So the midterms are testing how you can apply what you've learned in class. The chapter quizzes are there to make sure that you're keeping up with the class. So again, I'm trying to introduce as much flexibility as I can. So when we start a topic in class, I'm going to make our chapter quizzes available. So tonight, tomorrow, you'll see chapter 1. You can log into that on Moodle as many times as you want. There's no time limit, there's nothing. As long as you don't click the submit button, then you can keep coming back to it as much as you want. And you can look at your notes, you can re-listen to the lectures, you can talk with others in order to answer your questions until the exam or the midterm that is testing those topics. So the chapter 1, 2, and 3 quizzes will be available all the way up until September 27th. So I tell you that it's a good idea to work through them as we cover the topics in class, but maybe you're overwhelmed, another class is really busy, you need to give it some time. Okay, do chapters 2 and 3 at the same time right before the exam, whatever works for you. Those questions are going to be a little bit of a mixture. There will be a couple of memorization type questions. There will be a little bit of what do you understand about this topic, and then a little bit of the application type questions, which will be similar to what you see on the exams. But like I said, the purpose there is to show that you're going through the topics, you're understanding what's going on. That's why there's a mix of questions. And again, meant to be open book, so read through your notes, see if you can answer them that way. Right, okay. And then the last thing, the written assignment. All right, I always forget about the written assignment, and that's because I specifically don't talk a lot about it until after the first midterm. So the written assignment isn't due until November, and I don't talk about it until the beginning of October. And that's because it's the beginning of the year, you guys have enough going on right now. That's something we'll talk about later. Just to help alleviate any concerns, because sometimes when students see written assignment, they worry. Basically, what I'm going to get you to do is read a scientific article and give me a 2-page double-spaced evaluation of it. So it's not meant to be long, it's just meant to show that you can understand a scientific source. So I'll give you the details of what I'm looking for and the format and all of that after the first midterm, but it's not meant to be a big thing. I've had students where after you've read the article, it can be as little as an hour or 2 to write the paper part of it. It's not meant to be sort of an all-consuming assignment. So just another place to get marks from that isn't a multiple choice question. All right, so that's, I think, all the assessments. I mentioned the announcements on Moodle. I mentioned that I'm recording stuff. For the email policy, I mentioned that you should put stuff in the subject line of the email so I know which class you're emailing from. I also encourage you to try and give me some background on what you do understand about a topic when you send me an email. So instead of saying, I don't understand behaviorism, maybe you would say, okay, in class we talked about behaviorism and I got this part, but I don't know how to apply it. That kind of a statement gives me a better idea on what information you're looking for, and it means that I can give you a more useful response right off the bat. So whatever you can tell me about what you do and don't understand, that helps get a better answer. I also give the little caveat of I try not to check my emails too much evenings or weekends, because with online learning, it kind of became all-consuming. So I try and do sort of Monday to Friday business hours, and I keep it to about a 24-hour response time. So try not to leave anything too last minute, but for things that are super important, like you have to miss a midterm or something like that, the timestamp that's on your email is what matters to me, not when I respond to it. So if you're able to email me like the night before, even if I don't see it because it's midnight, that doesn't mean that I'm going to be upset that you didn't give me advance notice. I'm aware that it came in at midnight, I just didn't get the chance to respond yet. If I happen to notice things like that, I do try and respond because I know it can be stressful not knowing what to do in those situations. But just, yeah, we'll see how it goes. Which actually brings us to missed work and missed exams. So if you can't write a midterm, what I usually do is I'll have the weight of that midterm deferred to the final exam. That way I don't have to make a second or a third or a fourth version of a midterm so that you can write at a later date. I find it much easier because the final exam tests all of the topics throughout the year. We just move the weight to the final exam. And with midterms or quizzes or assignments or anything like that, if you can't make a sit down or if you can't make a deadline, just let me know in advance. So the more in advance you can tell me, the better. I can usually find some way to work around it. As I said, with the midterms, we just move that weight. But with an assignment, maybe I shift the due date. Maybe I give you an extra day, an extra 2 days, whatever you need. So try and give me as much warning as you can. And if you've had to miss something, sort of the cutoff, it says 24 hours. So if you've missed a midterm, you have to let me know within 24 hours. There's sort of an invisible asterisk there because I have had students who were, say, unable to contact me for a couple of days. Obviously, those are extenuating circumstances and we'll work something out. But I always let people know, like, that's sort of a worst case scenario, but things happen and I don't want you to have to panic if you're going to miss a deadline or something like that. For the final exam, we can't defer a final exam's weight. We would just have you write a different exam at a different time. And the university has their own process for dealing with that. So that would have to go through I believe it's the dean's office, but the info for all the specifics of that is again in the syllabus. And so there's quite a bit more information here, but as I said, we're hitting kind of the high points, the stuff that I think is most important. If you haven't read a syllabus before, maybe read it once so that you know what else is there. I think that was everything I needed to hit for introducing the course and myself. Before I hop into content, is there any questions or anything you need me to clarify? Not yet? All right, if you think of something, you can always ask later. Okay, so we are going to start with Chapter 1. I'm actually going to just pause for a second and grab a drink, so I'll give you a moment to pull out notes if you want them. All right, so at the beginning, I guess the big question is, if you're in an introduction to psychology course, what is psychology? And when people think of psychology, you probably get that sort of cartoonish vision of Freudian psychologists sitting in an office in a red armchair with someone on a couch in front of them, asking them to relive their darkest memories or something like that. But psychology is so much more than just studying and treating psychological disorders. We've kind of touched on the broadness of the field already, because I mentioned that I study communication and learning in songbirds, and that somehow qualifies me to be a psychologist. That's what my degrees are in, having studied that. So there's a lot more to psychology than what you might think off the surface. So yeah, we can have sort of treatment and study of psychological disorders, but we can look at things like lab rats running mazes. That falls under the category of learning, which falls under psychology. We can have studying development, how people and other animals develop over time. Things like biases, how our brains function, how we perceive things. Lots of stuff is going to fall under this umbrella of psychology. And as we go through the semester, we're going to hit quite a few very diverse topics. And even what I mentioned today, when I start talking about some of the history of psychology, we'll go into some of these areas and these fields in more detail as we start covering other topics. So we might mention very briefly, say, B.F. Skinner, who was a very influential figure in the learning community. And we'll talk a lot about him when we get to the chapter on learning. So this chapter is a broad introduction, and it's kind of giving you hints of what we'll cover in the future. And so one of the interesting things that I've found is that psychology as a field is actually fairly recent. It's only in the last 150, 200 years that psychology has been recognized as a standalone field. But the ideas that relate to psychology, the way we think about things, actually has a much longer history. We can go all the way back to Greek philosophers. So we're going to cover very briefly the far history, and then we'll focus a little bit more on the recent history. And so if we want to give the simplest answer to our what is psychology question, we can look at the breakdown of the word. So it's made up of two Greek words, psyche, meaning the soul, and logos, meaning to study. And so you'll have different definitions of psychology depending on your text or your instructor. I'm going to give you the two that I see most often. The first is the scientific study of behavior and the mind, and the second is the scientific study of conscious experience. Now, I include that scientific study of conscious experience because that is the one that our textbook has chosen to use. And I don't love it. My issue with that definition is that it kind of gives this idea that it only cares about consciousness, things that you're aware of. But as we get into more and more psychology, we find that the unconscious plays a big role in what's going on. And not everybody agrees on what is and is not conscious. So conscious experience is a little bit of a contentious phrase. So I'd much prefer the idea of psychology being the scientific study of behavior and the mind. Behavior being the things that we do, usually observable things, so actions. Me standing here talking is a behavior. Somebody's heart rate rising would be a behavior. That's something that we can observe and record as a psychologist. But we also include the mind, sort of the untangible stuff that comes with that. So yeah, I can stand up here and move and talk and lecture, but I'm also thinking about what I'm going to say. So my mind is doing other stuff, and you don't necessarily know what my mind is doing. So our behavior is observable, and the mind really isn't. And that sort of duality there will actually lead to some problems that we'll talk about a little bit later on when we get into sort of arguments that people have had in psychology. Now, we will spend a lot more time talking about how we do science and what science is and how research happens in Chapter 2. We have a whole chapter devoted to methods and research. But I will touch briefly here on the scientific approach and how we broadly consider research in psychology. So when we talk about a scientific study of behavior and the mind, we're focusing on something that is sort of a systemic gathering and evaluation of empirical evidence. And so if we break down all those words, we're saying that something is systemic, meaning that we're going to be performing this action according to a set of rules or conditions. So I use the example of, okay, so if I wanted to study frogs, maybe I walk across campus and I take pictures of frogs. That, by that description, isn't necessarily a systemic approach. That's not a scientific approach. That's me finding frogs and taking pictures. But if I said that I'm going to walk a specific line between this building and that building, I'm going to walk it every Tuesday, and I'm going to take a picture of every frog that I pass between those two locations every Tuesday for a year, then all of a sudden we could call that scientific, because that's a systemic approach. I've laid out my parameters, I have rules for when I take pictures, and if somebody else wanted to reproduce the results I got, they could do the same thing. Maybe the next year they walk the same path and take the same pictures, and theoretically they should find the same number of frogs. It has occurred to me that I don't know if Alberta actually has a whole lot of frogs. In Nova Scotia, you couldn't go very far without seeing frogs, but I don't think I've actually seen frogs here yet. But it's the same idea. So that's the systemic part. If we then want to talk about the empirical part, if we're gathering and evaluating empirical evidence, we're talking about what is it that we're looking at and how are we looking at it. So if we use the Merriam-Webster definition of empirical, we're saying that something is capable of being verified or disproven by observation or experiment. Now, we'll talk a lot more about this in the next chapter, but this is basically saying that if something is going to be scientific, if we're going to study a particular theory or idea, in order for it to be something worth studying scientifically, there needs to be some piece of evidence that you could be presented with that would tell you that what you think is happening isn't happening. And that's kind of a weird way to think about it, because most of the time when you talk about science, you talk about, oh, we know that this is happening or this thing has been proven. But as you get into science, you start realizing that that terminology isn't actually used by scientists. At least it shouldn't be. When we talk about scientific research, we can say that we've gathered evidence to support a particular theory. So I've taken enough pictures of frogs that I've figured out that frogs actually occur in Alberta. But I couldn't say that it's proven that this is, the only place they are or something like that. I can just say that I have evidence that supports a particular theory. But what we could do, I guess the frog example is not the best here, but it's very hard to prove that something is happening a particular way. It is a lot easier, or it is more acceptable in science terminology to say that you've disproven something. So if we think that songbirds learn their songs by listening to their neighbors, but we found that if we take the neighbors away, they still learn their songs, then we have disproven our theory that the song comes from the neighbors and there must be something else going on. We might be gathering evidence that they're producing the song themselves. Maybe it's something innate, something genetic that's leading to that song production, but we can't prove what else might be happening. We can just disprove that it was from the neighbors because we showed that to be false. So it'll be a little bit of a nitpicky thing that might actually come in handy when writing a critical evaluation of a scientific publication, where you won't say that something has been proven, but we can say we have more evidence for it. And so that's, again, sort of one of those little bit of a tangent about empirical and what it is we're looking for is the existence of a way that something can be disproven. All right, and so if we bring that all back to the beginning, where we have our systemic gathering and evaluation of empirical evidence, we're saying that we're going to be collecting data in a predictable way that follows the set of rules that we've laid out. And then once we have that data, we're going to evaluate it in a way that lets us either gain more evidence for the theory we're looking at or to disprove the theory that we're looking at. And that's the scientific process, where if we gain evidence, then we're more certain that we're on the right track, and maybe we'll do more studies that give us even more evidence. Or maybe we find out that we were wrong, we've disproven our theory, and now we have to try something else. So that's the scientific approach. All right, so next I want to talk a little bit about types of research. And these are terms that kind of switch up depending on who you talk to and how you talk to them. But we can talk about two broad categories of research, and then I'll mention a third category that kind of bridges the gap between these two. So we're going to have three categories in the end. But our basic division is going to be applied research and basic research. So if we start with basic research, that's research that's seeking knowledge for the sake of knowledge. I want to learn more about this thing because it's interesting. So I want to study black-capped chickadees because I think they're cool. So I want to listen to their songs and I want to figure out where they live. That's interest-based. I'm gathering information, but I don't necessarily need to do anything with that information. In contrast, applied research is research that's being applied to answer a particular question. So I want to learn about the songs that a black-capped chickadee sings because I want to know how maybe playing back songs will make them more likely to be in an area that's safe for them and less likely to be in an unsafe area. So I'm trying to learn about a particular thing to solve a particular problem. And because I like examples and I made a point to not have everything be birds, I also like cephalopods, so we can talk about squid and octopi, or octopuses I think is the more correct. So with our basic research, cephalopods have a lot of interesting qualities. Their eyes are strange, they perceive the world differently. So the Queensland Brain Institute is trying to do research to figure out how cephalopods see the world and communicate with each other. They're interested in understanding cephalopods. So that's basic research because they're trying to find out something cool. I always mention the example that I went to a conference on animal cognition, and one of the groups had been studying nautili, so category of cephalopods. They're sort of squids on the front with snail shells at the back. And they had been studying them for almost a year, and their entire presentation was, I think we now know what they eat. And I was like, oh, that is a lot of research to get that, but that is basic research. You learned something that you didn't know before, and you didn't necessarily know that's what you were trying to do. For our applied research example, we're sticking with the cephalopod region and looking at the octopus project. And so these are researchers that are studying how octopus limbs work in order to design a robot that they can use in underwater sort of applications. So they've got this really cool image, and that thing that I do where I include links to the sites, that's there as well. They have videos of these neat little tentacle-looking things that can move in sort of all different directions and interact with things underwater. So they're learning about octopus legs in order to then use it for a particular purpose to solve a particular problem. So that's some applied research. And this is a great point for me to give one of my hints that I almost always ask questions about basic versus applied. So if I give you an example of a type of research, I say that Bob loves penguins, so he studies penguins and counts how many there are. That would be applied research. But if Billy loves penguins and wants to make a robot that swims the same way as penguins because he needs to get from here to here in a specific amount of time, that's an applied project because he's solving a problem of getting from A to B the same way a penguin would. And I make up all sorts of strange examples for that. And we'll end with our third intermediate type of research, and this is translational research. And this is when you take the things that you learn from basic research and apply it to a specific problem. So you do the research with no end goal in mind. You find something really cool that you could then apply to a problem that exists. So it was originally basic research, but it ended up having a function. So we can call that translational research because it moves from being basic to being applied. So that's our third intermediate category. But that looks like we are at the end of class, so I will leave it there and we'll hop back in at this on Wednesday.